Hey everybody, welcome back to the JPU Show. I'm one of your co-hosts and the co-founder of the Jax Podcasters United group, bringing you this podcast today. My name is Badr Milligan, and I've got my co-host, right-hand woman, and you know where's the big brain I'm gonna keep that. I'm gonna go ahead and keep that. I am joined today by my right-hand woman, the big brain, Blythe Brumley. What up, Blythe? How you doing?
Oh, hello. I'm doing great.
You ready to get? Wow, that was very flat.
We just got done recording about kind of griping about a podcast study, and now we're about to and it's talking about sort of make every minute count, keep podcast listeners there, and now we're about to talk about long podcasts.
Yes, we are. So today's topic, we're talking about the length of your podcast. You know, how long is too long of an episode? Like, is there a sweet spot that we should aim for as podcasters? We hope to tackle some of those questions in this video. This topic is brought to you by Big Brain Blythe Brumley. So I get to step back a little bit and, hear her set us up. So Blythe, what do you got for us today?
Well, Ashley Carmen, who is probably like a regular, not a guest on this show, but she is a regular feature on this show. She is the Bloomberg podcast editor and our podcast journalist. And so she covers podcasting for Bloomberg. And so she releases a weekly newsletter that I really enjoy reading. And so one of her latest topics was talking about the length of a podcast. And quoting her, she says, last month, Lex Fridman published a nearly 9-hour conversation with Elon Musk and other Neuralink executives. Last week, Stephen Bartlett, host of Diary of a CEO, released an interview between himself and another serial long talker, Andrew Huberman, that spanned 4 hours. And they said that the Musk chat has since generated over 3.3 million views on YouTube, while the Huberman chinwag, what is that? What does chinwag mean?
I feel like we might have to throw in an adult disclaimer on this episode if we go down that rabbit hole.
I don't know if that's a good thing to say about Huberman or not, but these are Ashley's words, not mine. She said, while the Huberman chinwag has racked up over 1.2 million. So a 4-hour podcast getting 1.2 million views on YouTube, and then a 9-hour podcast generating 3.3 million views on YouTube. And they go on to say data is showing us that people are enjoying the longer episodes, and so that's frankly coming from the executive director at Flight Studio, and that is the Bartlett-founded podcast company behind Diary of a CEO. And so that's 9 hours, 4 hours. What's typically the length of a podcast that you listen to?
Ooh, okay. So I would say on average, all right, one ep is about an hour and a half on some days, but not very rarely. Then you got QLS, which is mainly a pod interview. I guess, all right, I'm not going to go down the whole list. On average, I would say an hour and a half.
That's about for me too.
Maybe sometimes there's 2 hours, but I have this one podcast I listen to that I love their structure, where it's called What Had Happened Was. And they treat it like seasons, and they focus on one guest per season. And every season is roughly, I think, up to 10 episodes, about an hour, maybe an hour and a half each, but about at least an hour. And they go through their entire lives. So every episode you're hearing about, and they mainly interview musicians and producers. So it'll be about a body of work or a project or, this point in their life and whatnot. And I love that approach to telling a long form story and doing a long form interview, where that this entire season is going to be about this one person, but every episode, even though it'll be about the same guest, it'll be about different topics in their life. So that way you don't feel like you're trying to get all of it in one episode, or you have not a 9-hour interview. That kind of blew me away. But at the same time, it's like, well, it's a conversation for Elon Musk and executives from Neuralink, and I imagine there's probably a lot to be said about that topic. I just don't know if I would ever listen to a straight 9-hour show of one person. I kind of like the idea of it being broken down. What about you?
Yeah, even like half of that, like 3 or 4 hours, I'm like, oh, you better have a lot to say, a lot of good stuff to say. And then even then, like for Joe Rogan, which I have the opinion that the majority of mean, he's obviously the most popular podcaster, but I personally like to listen to his show because of some of the guests. Like, I don't really care about like the fighters or the UCF people that come on the show. I just won't watch it. But I love the guests that he has on the show because I feel like he asks questions of like the common man. And so what comes out of those long form discussions is usually some clips that he'll put out or that his team will put out. And so if it's somebody I've never heard about before, but they maybe are like there was one recently that's like a psychologist of like behavioral studies, and or they talk about the ancient whatever it's whatever the title of that person is. I do find if I find it somewhat interesting, I'll watch a smaller clip. And then if I like the smaller clip, if I enjoyed it, then I possibly will go and listen to the 2 or 3 hour long discussion. I genuinely don't know of any situation where I have seen like a 3 hour show and been like, yes, I'm going to listen to that. I think it really just has to depend on the topic. It has to depend on the guest. There's a lot of variables in that regard. But I will say in my own data and my own show, when I release like best of episodes around the December timeframe, I will typically take like 3 to 4 episodes. I will edit them together, and they are, several hours long. And those episodes get just as many plays as my normal sort of 45-minute episodes. And so I think what I theorize is happening here is people are pressing play because they're going on a long road trip. They want something playing in the background. I don't know that you're listening to a 9-hour discussion intently and listening and hanging on to every word unless it's an audiobook. What about you? What is your listening experience like outside of the shows that you regularly listen to? What's making you press play on a show longer than 2 hours?
Glad you said that. So I want to bring up a few points. For starters, I was trying to look for what is the longest episode I ever put out. At the moment, I had to do some scrolling because my arbitrary thought process, or my sweet spot in terms of releasing episodes, to me, an hour, 15 minutes is the sweet spot. Hour to an hour 15 is what I'll say. An hour is as long as a show, a Netflix episode, or maybe not a movie. That's way too short. But like an hour, to me, is approachable. That is a respectable amount of time for indie podcaster or an interview. You can get a lot out of an interview if it's conducted well, if it's if the host knows what he's doing and has done his prep work and there's a mission. Hour 15 is, it might be the longer I go. Sometimes I'll do an hour and a half, but I usually try to aim for an hour 15 because it's just a little more. It's like, hey, this is an hour 15, so I'm not completely taking all of your time, but I'm giving you a little more. Now, I'm trying to look at what's the longest episode I've put out, and the one without boring people with me just scrolling, the longest one I've put out in recent memory was last September, which was for our 400th episode on the Short Box. It was 2 hours and 10 minutes. Now, mind you, I did that episode, I think, with the full cast, so 3 other co-hosts. And, 3 other co-hosts, and we were talking about, like, the history of the podcast and recollecting, like, favorite memories. So I think you can get away. I think the more guests or hosts, I think you can get away with longer episodes because, everyone is going to want to talk and get us some spotlight. So I that's what I want to share, is that my sweet spot, hour 15 now, especially if it's a one-on-one interview. I don't think it needs to go any longer. In this article, she does mention, she mentions Drink Champs, which is also a long-form music-focused show in which the two hosts, Nori and DJ EFN, they bring on people to literally sit around, drink, and tell stories. They do an interview. The questions, in my opinion, are not the best, but it's like a vibe, right? Like you're watching them get drunk and tell old stories and laugh and be loud. It's sometimes unprofessional as hell, but there's a charm to it. And I will admit, I only watch certain episodes of that. Like, it's got to be a guest or someone that I really want to hear from. And I know that I'm not listening attentively. I think even in the article, they mentioned that what does it say here? In general, considering that many of the longest shows publish a video version, it seems likely that many listeners and viewers are keeping these programs on largely in the background, only intensely tuning in during peak moments of interest, which I co-sign 100%. The longer the video, and if I have the attention or want to press play, more than likely I'm keeping it on in the back, and I'm only jumping in when I hear something that piques my interest. And I think, not to go off on a complete tangent, but in a related way, when I talk about the pros of podcasting, I tend to bring up like the relationship between the listener and the podcast itself, right? That kind of connection, that intimacy to it, having it so close in your ear, and having these voices in your head, whatever. But I think eventually there's shows that I know I listen to just because it's out of habit and there is a familiarity to it. There's like a coziness is a word I guess I think about, having familiar voices where sometimes you don't care about what the topic is, but they kind of feel like friends, right? Like the First Issue Club is another comic podcast, one of the few comic podcasts I listen to. There's 3 co-hosts, and I actually prefer their episodes go a little longer than my normal sweet spot of an hour and a half, because a lot of times I listen to them out of comfort. Like, granted, they are entertaining, they're funny, but there's a sense of like, I'm doing stuff around the house. I want something familiar and comfortable. And I think that's kind of the benefit of these long shows. I'll be honest with you, like Drink Champs, as a podcaster and someone that takes editing very serious, I try to challenge myself to fit in that hour and a half time frame. Sometimes I'm taking 2-hour shows, I'm trying to cut 45 minutes, which is a challenge. But I think having a lean show that gets to the point, that has takeaways, that's entertaining, is the way to go. If I want to drop the full 2 hours, that's what Patreon is. Some people don't mind, having the full thing with the fat. I'm more of the mind of like, keep it lean for my shows in particular. There are some long form ones where I know for a fact, like, on Drink Champs, this 3-hour show, from a producer and editor standpoint, I'm like, you could have cut that, and this would have been a bomb interview. But there is something to just having something on, not having to think about what's the next thing I'm going to play or what's going to be in my queue. I have this, I don't know, I think I'm kind of greedy with podcasts where I don't want to burn through all my episodes in one sitting. So having sometimes the benefit of those long shows is having, drawing out like the entertainment factor to it.
Yeah, I think that was my more bigger takeaway, is that there's decision fatigue. You hear about folks who open up Netflix and they're spend all of their time searching for something to watch and to digest, and they come up with nothing. And it's because you have so many choices. And so I think the phrase is like death by 1,000 decisions. And so anytime that you can remove a decision from someone, I think actually helps. And if say around the holiday season, for example, the way my thought process is, the way I think about it is that you're going to be probably traveling a lot. So you need something that's a few hours long. Maybe you're hanging out with family and you just need a break. Maybe you're, I don't know, wrapping presents or getting ready or doing chores around the house. That is an opportunity to be someone's distraction, be someone's complement to what's going on in their life. It very famously, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, they wear the same outfit every single day. They wear a black shirt and jeans. And they do that because they don't want to have an extra decision. They want the decisions that they're making for that day to be the most impactful. They don't want to waste that decision process thinking on stuff that doesn't matter. And so I think with these longer episodes, what we're seeing is just people that are experiencing decision fatigue, and they just want something to listen to of, people that or topics that they find interesting, and they can just hit play and not really have to worry all that much about intently listening. Like, there are some shows that I know that I can't listen to at the same time that I'm working, or that vice versa. Or I can't work while this show is on because I need to pay attention to one or the other. So I think where, the trend with some of these is that almost that second screen for people, but it's like second listenership, or maybe like second focus. I think there's a lot of studies around like, watching TV, watching shows, and knowing that people will have that second screen with them, which is typically their phone. So how can you create content that complements that new shift in the attention economy? And maybe this also signals that, with listening to these longer episodes, sure, you might not be listening intently to every single minute of that show, but you're still press and play. I mean, 3.3 million people listen to a 9-hour show, and YouTube arguably has the best viewer sort of stats collection reporting out of all social media channels, where a view counts as you listened with the audio on for at least 30 seconds. Now, with a 9-hour discussion, that's kind of that could be skewed a little differently. But just to put it in perspective, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, they all count views on your content as 3 seconds or less, and the audio does not have to be on. So YouTube is significantly better in that regard, where someone hits play on an episode, and if you can get through the first, sort of 30 seconds and then get into the meat of the show, then you've probably got them hooked for a little while. And if you can make that decision fatigue a little bit easier on your audience, then maybe you could be that resource. I have found that my best of episodes, I mentioned earlier, that they perform just as well as my regular episodes. So the next step for me, especially this year, as we'll probably start planning those out here soon, is that how can I, for people who have never listened to my show, how can I put together some best of episodes that they can binge my content easily and then become a regular listener to the rest of the shows? We had done a previous show about, different podcasting stats, and in the Sounds Profitable podcasting report. And it's only 3.5 shows that people are listening to a week, and that's active podcast listeners. And so if you can make a piece of long form content that is engaging to your audience, you can help them remove that decision fatigue, play on your episode instead of trying out, a bunch of different episodes and kind of, you're worried about, is this episode going to be wasting my time or not? Tend to think that some of the longer episodes, once they hit play, I think you kind of got them.
I will say, I guess, to throw in a tip as we're closing this episode out. If you are if you're an existing podcaster that has a few episodes that you can reference, I know at this point almost every podcast platform, such as Spotify, I'm thinking Apple Podcasts, I believe YouTube as well, if you have your show on there, they show the metrics of listener retention. So you can kind of get an idea of how long the listeners stayed on your episode. I know Apple Podcast does that. Sometimes it's a little demoralizing because you're like, I really put my heart and soul into this, and people only listen to 10 minutes. But I think it does. And that was a big motivator for me to cut down my shows. I used to do 2-hour shows easy, sometimes even 3. But I started paying attention to that stat of like, well, people are only listening to 45 minutes, 50 minutes. Why am I putting that extra work in? That, that extra time could be dedicated to something else in my podcast process. So I think this is a great opportunity to like let the data drive your decision as far as like how long you can make a show. Now, granted, if you enjoy long form conversations, if that's your thing, then stick with it. But I challenge you to look at the listener retention and see if there's something that you could pick up. Does it sway you in a way to do longer shows or shorter shows? Because I think on the opposite, if you find that, people are consuming 80% of your 2-hour episode, keep on doing it. Maybe there's something else you could do within that episode to boost retention. But
yeah. I think too, it's very determinate on the topic, on the guest. If you have a bomb ass guest and they can talk for longer than an hour and you feel like you haven't got your questions in, go longer. We've discussed and tried to strategize what is the perfect length for our show, and frankly we don't know. And my mantra has always been the episodes need to go as long as they need to, but there are some moments, especially for myself, that I kind of go off on a tangent, but sometimes the tangents are good. Sometimes they're terrible. But don't, I guess, restrict your creativity just to stay within a certain time block. Let the content speak for itself, but also this is kind of going to be double speak, but embrace the challenge of making every minute count. And I think that was one of the things that they pointed out. The quote is, "It's not important to ship every good minute." And this is coming from that Gilbert guy who is he's behind the Diary of a CEO podcast company. Says it's not important to ship every good minute. It's important to ship only great minutes. If you're actually intellectually, that's an odd word to mess up on. If you're actually intellectually honest with yourself, that's how to release a really good product. And so he says, even with longer run times, their audience listens to the vast majority of each episode. And considering their deep dive on, Lockheed Martin, which was an episode that was 3 hours and 38 minutes, on Apple Podcasts, the average listener consumes 70% of the show. Another episode on Nike clocks upwards of 4 hours at an average consumption rate of 68%. Every time we made something longer, people only seem to love it more. So if the content is determined, if the content is good, make it longer. But I think there's a lot of factors at play here, as per the usual.
I think I absolutely co-sign letting the content drive it. If it's a good conversation, keep it going. Because you can always edit. I think that is one thing I wanted to bring up here. That 3 to 4 hour episode they released about Lockheed Martin, I think they said it was actually a 9-hour recording session. So they did a lot of cutting. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, 3-hour recording session. So you could leverage. I think it's a fine line, right? Like, let the content speak to itself. Let your creativity flow. I think you rely on editing to cut down a long show. Like, obviously find those great moments, emphasize that. But I think I want to also emphasize preparation. There's something you can do in the beginning and post. I think the better prepped you are, whether that be studying for a guest, preparing questions, having an outline at the very least, doing your research, whatever, goes a long way in getting better moments or great moments and saving yourself time in editing. You know me, I'm always, I come from a consistency standpoint, having done it for 12, 13 years, you just as long. I'm always looking for ways to just stay consistent and be efficient. But like you said, and I think as this article states, if you got a great guest, let the content drive it, right? Let the content drive it.
On the flip side, I know you were probably trying to close it out, but do you ever listen to any of like the 2-minute long podcasts? Like, here's a daily news type podcast.
No, because it makes me mad. Because I'm like, these guys are doing 2-minute shows and are way more successful.
I see it and I get mad too. But I'm like, great. 2 minutes? Like, you're genuinely wasting my time reading this. That's how I feel. So if I see like anything 5 minutes or lower, I'm skipping it 1000% of the time. That is so, I think, incorrect of a format for podcast medium in general. If you want short content like that, take that shit to TikTok. Like that. I was
about to say, yeah.
That is where that short attention span lives. When someone is coming into a podcast app, they are looking to be educated, entertained for, I would say at least 30 minutes. For your episodes. And so that was just sort of the flip side that I wanted to get out there is, just know the platform of the audience and the audience's intentions of when they're coming to that platform and what they're trying to see.
Well
Podcasting 5 minutes or less, get that shit out of here, but maybe experiment with 3-hour episodes.
Yeah, if it works for you. All right, here's where we're going to take our own advice, because I feel like we hit our sweet spot for this episode, and we're going to turn the tables on the listeners. What do you think about podcast links? Is there a sweet spot? Do you have a sweet spot that you aim for? Do you put restrictions, or do you go all out and you're putting out 3-4 hour episodes? We would love to hear from you guys. All right, leave us a comment in the comment section on the YouTube, or send us a message. If you're listening to the podcast version, there's a link in the episode show notes. Check those out. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully you learned something new. And this has been a great episode. Life, you got anything to say?
That's it. Cutting it short.
Here we go. All right. Be well, take care, and thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you around later.